Today we're going to talk about how to fix anxiety, and the good news is that yes, it is fixable. The anxiety response is related to a fear response, and it has been around with us since our development as human beings. The mechanism which is involved with fear and with anxiety is called your fight, flight, or freeze response. And when we are under attack, we can jump into any one of those three modes. A good example of a fight response would be if in the old days, let's say the Vikings were attacking our village and we may have to be in a situation where we would fight. An example of a flight response might be if a predator jumped out in front of us and then we would have to run. Now, the important thing to be able to survive is for our big muscles to be working properly. And the number one component which drives these responses is a thing called adrenaline. And in order to survive, we need our big muscles to be working properly. So adrenaline facilitates more blood going into these big muscles around our bodies so we can survive. The question I ask everybody who has a tendency towards anxiety is, where is this blood coming from? So it's not like we have a container that we pick up and we pour some extra blood into these big muscles. It's actually coming from other areas in our bodies. Any ideas? The blood comes from the two biggest organs in our body. And those two organs are the gut and the skin. So when we are under an anxiety response, our skin and our guts are impaired. They are not working properly because all that blood has shifted to help us to survive. Now, the adrenaline response is quite short acting, but there is a longer, more chronic type of anxiety, and this is driven by a chemical called cortisol. And people are under the impression that cortisol, or having raised cortisol, is bad for you. And that's a little bit misleading. Cortisol is not bad for you. It plays a very, very important response in trying to regulate our bodies. What is bad is what is driving that cortisol to be raised. And if we can identify what is raising that cortisol, then we can do something about it. Unfortunately, there is way too much weight given to the psychological components of anxiety as opposed to the physiological components, that is, the stuff that's happening in your body. The second thing to be aware of is the mechanisms of cortisol and blue light. We've got a chemical that makes us sleep, and this is called melatonin. So essentially, when the light changes at night, it gets darker, and melatonin starts to be made in our bodies, and it helps us go to sleep. In the morning, what happens is the sky changes color and turns to blue, and it's this blue that has the biggest effect in switching off melatonin. And the chemical that's used to switch off melatonin is cortisol, so it keeps us awake. So apart from the blue sky, which stimulates a cortisol response, other types of light also continue this cortisol response. And some of the things with the most blue light in them are those little things we carry in our hands, our mobile phones. They also include things like gaming. They include things like television, the news. And if you think about it, a lot of your social media platforms have got a blue type of component to them. So Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc., etc. And again, this is to keep us hooked in and it keeps us engaged. This is why it's very, very difficult at times to just stop scrolling and to walk away from these screens because of this little addictive component. It just so happens that modern living is bombarding us continually with all sorts of aspects of fear. We have bills to pay, we have stresses from relationships, we have financial stresses, we have relationship stresses, we have physical stresses, and all these can take their toll on us. Now, the thing about fear is it has a slightly addictive component to it. But if we have this perception that we are continually under attack and we don't know how to switch off this response, then we are going to have what is called chronic anxiety, and this can be extremely debilitating. And all of our big companies know this. This is why the majority of the message that's coming through to you from your television and from social media is driven by fear. So for example, every time you turn on the news, you're always being pushed about scary and fearful things that are happening around the world. You might have a little bit at the end, which is a feel-good story, but the predominant message that you're continually getting, if you're looking at screens and television all day long, is one of fear. Once you're aware of this, you can do something about limiting your exposure to these messages. So one of the first steps towards treating anxiety is to diarize your screen time and to look at what you are exposing yourself to psychologically. I think many people, if they specifically write down how much screen time they are engaging in and what they're looking at, they will be fairly shocked to see how all this stuff adds up. The second step is to be aware of this addictive component. And like all addictions, they are difficult to get past. So once we have this set out nice and clear in our minds, we can realize that when we're compelled to pick up our phones or to turn on television or to keep looking at screens, we now know that it's not just because we like this engagement. It is actually a mild form of addiction. And once we get that into our heads, we can actually do something about minimizing our screen time. We can consider things like putting our devices in grayscale mode, so in other words, turning them to black and white, or using things like blue light blockers. And then we also look at the content which we're getting exposed to. If it's fear-based from the news and from hearing about pandemics and wars and all sorts of horrible things happening in the world, we have to limit our exposure to this. So cortisol is a very important chemical in how our bodies function and work. But having this cortisol response stimulated continually is where the problem lies. Our healing and our repair system, it's a little bit like the brake and the accelerator on a car. If you press the brake and the accelerator at the same time, they both cancel each other out. So the way we heal is to switch off as much as possible. So this takes us to the next step about how we can control anxiety. And this step lies in trying to find stillness. Now, if you are used to being continuously stimulated, you'll find this very, very difficult initially. But the key is in the trying, not in the success. So you need to find as many times where you can have stillness as possible during the day. Initially, you might only be able to do 5 seconds, and then you might be able to get longer and longer and longer. But the longer you can be still without stimulus can have a profound effect on healing. What I often hear is people say, when I start to have an anxiety attack, there's no way I can find stillness, or there's no way I'm able to engage in a breathing technique. And this is why you have to practice those things outside of when you're having an anxiety attack. The analogy I often use is one of martial arts. I'm not going to start training in a fight. I'm going to have wanted to have done 2 or 3 years of training outside of a fight situation to be able to defend myself when the time is necessary. And in the same way, you have to practice these things outside of having an actual anxiety attack, and you improve your skill. There is no end point. You start, you accept that you might not be very good at these things, and you persist, and you increase the amount of time that you're doing these things every day until you get better and better. Then when the time comes, you can use these techniques more effectively. After this, you need to know about the power of what we call active breathing. And active breathing helps us to control what is called our parasympathetic nervous system. Our sympathetic nervous system is based on all these types of adrenaline and cortisol responses, and the parasympathetic nervous system is something which we are told that we don't really have control over. But in actual fact, active breathing exercises and techniques can control the parasympathetic or the autonomic nervous system, and learning 1, 2, or 3 different types of breathing techniques can actually do things like slow our heart rate down and improve blood flow to different areas of our bodies. So when you're finding stillness, you can do this in isolation, or you can combine this with a breathing technique. There's lots of fantastic ones out there. You can look at box breathing, you can look at Wim Hof technique, you can look at the 4-7-8 technique, and in some of my previous videos, I do explain about how to do some of these. Another part of finding stillness may be engaging in a hobby, something like fishing, something like painting or drawing, but reducing that stimulation and getting lost in the moment. This is why nature can play a huge role. Our modern life now has us more or less continuously connected to devices, and we are collecting different types of electricity which build up in our bodies, and these electrical charges are actually also making us a little bit sick. A way to diffuse these charges is to go in nature. It's interesting that with lots of these chronic mental health conditions, they come along with a raise in inflammatory markers. So tackling the inflammation can actually lead to some incredible outcomes. There are some amazing studies that show a dramatic anti-inflammatory effect when we actually connect our feet to the earth. Take your shoes off, walk in the water, go to the beach, go swimming. Now we're going to jump back and talk about our stomach again. And if we have a cortisol response, remember it's a little bit like an adrenaline response, what it does is it means that our blood flow to our gastrointestinal tract is not optimal. And as a result, the food and what we take in, we are not absorbing the micronutrients and all those good things that we need to stay healthy. In one of my last videos, we talked about the mechanisms behind depression, and I encourage you to have a look at that because the same underlying principles are really important to be aware of when we want to address anxiety. And if we do have anxiety, toxicity plays a dramatic part in trying to get our bodies back to an equilibrium. So it is absolutely essential to have as optimal a diet as possible. And this diet has to be low sugar and low, if not zero, processed foods. The type of water you drink and the cleaner it is also incredibly important. Now, if you're able-bodied, there's a few little hacks you can use if you start to get this response towards anxiety. Remember, you have all this blood that's in your big muscles. So this is why we have these symptoms of being restless and our hands are shaking and our legs feel like they want to move. But it's the blood going from the other areas in our bodies that give us these other uncomfortable symptoms. Because the blood flow is reduced to our guts and our stomachs, sometimes we feel that maybe our bowels want to move. If we want to survive from a tiger, we don't need a bladder full of urine, so sometimes we feel we have to urinate or pee. The higher blood pressure to get the blood into those big muscles also perfuses our kidneys more, which means that we feel like peeing more as well. Our breathing speeds up and quickens because we want to oxygenate our body more in order to survive. And remember, that blood is going from our skin. So sometimes we have a cold, clammy feeling. We have goosebumps. We might have sweaty brow. We might have the hair on the back of our neck standing up. But the absolutely vital thing I want to explain is that these symptoms are normal and they mean that your body is responding appropriately to this stress anxiety response. This is how we were designed. Once you know this, you can have less fear of these responses when they're actually taking place. So when this starts, a great way to counteract and to stop the cascade getting worse is to do what your body is asking you to do. Your body is asking you to fight or go into a flight mode. So you can do exactly that. Depending on your physical capabilities, one of the best things to do when you find that anxiety response starting is to do high intensity exercise. That's different for different people. It might be taking out a skipping rope. It might be doing sit-ups and press-ups. It might be going for a sprint or a run. And this has the effect of dispersing those stress hormones throughout your body and you using them in a way that your body was designed for. Sometimes getting anxious itself causes more anxiety. Those first few symptoms of your increased heart rate, your strange feeling in your stomach, that strange kind of altered perception in your mind, bring along with it the fear of a full-blown anxiety attack. So if you do engage in high intensity exercise, it is very, very difficult to be in the middle of a full-blown anxiety attack if you are doing push-ups, or if your legs are burning from running up a hill, or if you are cycling, or if you do something that stresses your body. It may surprise you to know that our bodies don't really realize the difference between excitement and fear. The same set of responses actually take place in our bodies. And the final part of the puzzle is our belief system. If we accept a diagnosis of chronic anxiety, this could have a detrimental effect on us. Whereas if we accept that we have a tendency towards being anxious, then we have an idea that maybe our condition can get better if we manage our symptoms appropriately. You have to have a belief that your condition is curable. This is called the placebo effect, and the placebo effect is one of the most powerful healing components that we can unlock in our bodies. Should you want any more information, feel free to message me or to reach out, and I can guide you through these things in a little bit more detail. And feel free to subscribe, to like the video, and to leave comments.